Apple II forever, making life better and better. Apple II forever and ever, bringing the rainbow to you.
Welcome to my talk. My name is Micah Cowan. This mini-talk is about Bobbin, my still very work-in-progress special-purpose Apple II emulator. You can find out about my other projects in the links on this page. My links and contact info will be shown again at the end of the talk. Okay, so why would you want to use Bobbin as your Apple II emulator of choice when there are 100 others out there? Chances are you wouldn't, especially if you're just looking to fire up some software and just get to playing games or, I don't know, tracking your finances in VisiCalc, whatever doots your doodle. Bobbin is an emulator aimed at developers, or at quick launching a simple Apple II instance very rapidly, without the boot-up overhead of a quote-unquote application. In particular, Bobbin's GUI is likely to remain as non-existent as MAME's. In fact, as of right now, its only interface is a terminal interface, and the emulator only works within Apple II's text display modes, though this will change in the future. But even when it does, there will most likely just be a graphical display, no GUI controls. And even if I'm wrong and it gets GUI controls, they'll probably never be as comprehensive as Virtual 2 or Apple Win. And Bobbin is very much a work in progress at this point in time. It's planned to have, but currently doesn't emulate, a 65C02, which means it can't emulate an enhanced Apple IIe, but only the original 2, the 2 Plus, and the lame unenhanced 2e. It's planned to have graphics, but as mentioned, currently only display of the text pages is supported. It's planned to support sound, and hard drives via SmartPort. All of this is still forthcoming. It can't currently play Prince of Persia or Choplifter, and even when it eventually does, it will probably never be your first choice for doing so. Alright, with that out of the way, let's leave talk of how much my pet project sucks, and move on to why it still also kinda rocks. And to get to that, we'll start with the question, why did I write Bobbin? Well, I wrote Bobbin because there were two specific things I wanted emulators to be able to do that I hadn't really found amongst existing ones. The first reason I wanted an emulator like Bobbin is to promote a much faster development cycle for writing Apple II software. A couple of years ago, I tried out Stephen Hugg's 8bitworkshop.com, which is an IDE that runs entirely in your browser for writing software for a very wide variety of retro computing and console platforms, and an accompanying series of guidebooks available on Amazon that gently guide you through the process of writing software for a number of these supported platforms. It runs almost entirely client-side, requiring server-side support only for its GitHub integration. Because yeah, it has GitHub integration. As soon as I tried 8-Bit Workshop, I immediately made it my go-to development platform for Apple II software. Despite several annoying drawbacks, including a very inflexible start location for your program, and copyright-free alternative firmware ROMs by default, unencumbered by both copyrights and most useful features, it had a key feature that easily improved my development productivity by an order of magnitude at least. 8-Bit Workshop includes a host of compilers and assemblers, including CC65, built into this browser IDE as WebAssemblies using Emscripten. And while you type your code, it automatically rebuilds your project and reloads the emulator with it. This means that if I've made a glaring error with the statement I just finished typing, whether it be a syntax error or a runtime error, I can know about it as soon as I've typed it. This was an absolute game changer for me. But as I mentioned, there were also drawbacks. Many of them are fixable, and I did contribute some improvements to this free and open source IDE. But the main issue I found I had with it is that it has necessarily had to reinvent the wheel with the included but limited editor, the included but limited emulator, and the included but very limited Git support. I'm a fan of modularity, and rather than investing my efforts in contributing a bunch of improvements to the editor, the emulator, and the GitHub glue, I thought I'd rather use my actual favorite editor with the actual official Git and GitHub tools, and have the fuller suite of all of the actual build tools available to me, and just focus my efforts on having an emulator only that can instantly respond to code rebuilds. And so that's what Bobbin is. Someone else can worry about the other missing part, an editor that will automatically rebuild my code while I type it. I imagine VS Code might have a feature for this, and you could definitely coax Emacs into doing it. So here's an example clip of Bobbin being used to fill that same space. I edit some text, and the change is quickly reflected in Bobbin. I accidentally failed to terminate an important loop. I see that too. A disadvantage in relation to 8-Bit Workshop is that in this clip, I'm still having to take the extra step to explicitly save my work before it rebuilds and reloads, so it's not quite happening just as soon as I type. But it's close enough that I'm happy. I also had to set up a separate loop script that checks for code changes and rebuilds the project. That part also isn't handled by Bobbin. So motivation number 1 for writing Bobbin was a rapid development cycle comparable to 8-Bit Workshop, but with better interoperation with other favorite tools. Motivation number 2 was, I wanted an emulator that I could just fire up in my terminal to try something out real quick. Look how fast I can get to an Apple II prompt. That -M plus bit, by the way, won't be required once Enhanced 2E emulation is supported, which will be the default. I just didn't want anyone to get accustomed to getting a 2 plus or an unenhanced 2E by default and then switch things up on them later after they'd gotten used to it. So I can get an emulator up and running right away, and I can paste in code from some website snippet or the like, or I can cat a basic program into it to play around with. Whatever I needed to quickly grab an emulator for and experiment with, it's there. Bobbin is also great if you want to use a basic program as a Unix command for some reason. With the --run basic option only, you can use a shebang line. Bobbin needs to be somewhere on your path, of course, or else the shebang line needs to specify the full path to it. Here's a simple example where the text of input lines is reversed for output. There's no access to any command line arguments, of course. Could maybe add that if someone really wanted it, but honestly, I don't see this getting a ton of use. I'm told that Bobbin is a great choice for use with a screen reader, which wasn't on my radar when I started writing it, but makes sense. Bobbin's simple mode interface just uses the standard command line input and output, so it would be pretty straightforward for a screen reader to see what it's doing. The user who was using Bobbin for this had previously been stuck with a very old DOS emulator, as it was the only one they had found that could work with a screen reader. But once DOS went the way of the dodo, they were left with MAME, running with an emulated speech synthesis peripheral. But they're not able to swap disks on the fly in MAME, as the necessary UI elements aren't accessible through the emulated speech synthesizer. Of course, with Bobbin, right now they're suffering from things like lack of hard drive support to be implemented in the near future, hopefully. I want it too, so I can get 4AM's Pitch Dark collection running. And of course, you could set Bobbin up to be a remotely accessible Apple II emulator. Apple II over Telnet, anyone? I think that'd be pretty cool, and want to have that set up on my own server soonish. Currently, Bobbin has a couple of potentially unsafe commands that can read or write arbitrary files, but I could add options to disable those, and anyway, in the meantime, I could run it in a VM or Docker container. So far in this talk, I've mostly been showcasing the so-called simple interface, but the default interface at a terminal is actually a more realistic N-curses-based display of the Apple II's text display, which could work nicely over Telnet. You saw a bit of that interface earlier with the automatic reloading demo for rapid development cycles. Bobbin does have a built-in debugger. It's not currently very feature-rich, and most of the features only work in the simple text interface, and not the curses interface. But I'm already finding it quite handy. You can also trace disassembled instructions as execution proceeds to help you figure out why things are going wrong. There is no support for symbols currently. Let's see. You can kind of hack Bobbin via scripting to be a disk image editor of sorts, at least provided the disk you boot from drops you into a DOS prompt and not a hello program. It can kind of sort of serve as a disk image editor by actually loading up Bobbin with DOS or ProDOS, loading in a binary file, and feeding scripted bsave commands to Bobbin's input. So you can see here, load a disk image up, feed a catalog to the emulator, you get the output out, and Bobbin exits because it's done processing input. And Bobbin has an option to hang around and switch input to the terminal if the standard input is depleted, but we didn't give that. Then we tell Bobbin to load up a binary file into RAM and feed it a bsave command to save that piece of RAM. With the options you see given here, the order of operations is Bobbin boots up the disk, the program counter reaches the key in input subroutine, at which point, due to that delay until option, it loads prog.bin into RAM at the designated location at hex 300. Bobbin will exit because input is exhausted, but it waits until the emulated disk drive has stopped spinning. And then, of course, the following two shell commands are getting another catalog to demonstrate that the file has indeed been saved, and a brun to demonstrate that the command was correctly stored and retrieved. The intent is for Bobbin to be highly scriptable and tweakable. I've already shown that with its simple mode text interface, you can feed input and process output from Bobbin, and this is plenty to allow someone to script the emulator using expect, which, if you're not familiar with, is an old scripting language originally written in Tickle for watching for particular program output and responding with programmed input. But Bobbin's internals are where Bobbin's flexibility really shows. All of the interesting things inside Bobbin, including disk drive and other peripheral emulation, the current two text interfaces, and especially the ability to feed text from a file into Bobbin's keyboard inputs, and to print the emulated machine's output back out as text, are all implemented in terms of events and event hooks. For output, the interface watches for the CPU to step into the monitor's character output routine, grabs whatever is in the CPU's accumulator register, and translates it to ASCII as appropriate. For input, it watches for whenever a bus read event is happening for the keyboard soft switch and supplies a chosen value. Bobbin has a mode for acting as a tokenizer for BASIC to produce binary files suitable for storing in disk images, and for detokenizing the BASIC back out to ASCII. The tokenizer works by feeding the input file into the emulator, character by character, and then saving a snapshot of the tokenized BASIC in RAM out to the file. The detokenizer starts up the emulator and waits for it to prompt for a line of input. It does this by again watching the program counter to reach a particular place in memory. When the tokenizer sees that the Apple II is prompting the user for input, it knows that all of the firmware's necessary initialization has now taken place, so it magically teleports the tokenized BASIC program into RAM and jumps the program counter to AppleSoft's list command. It also continually resets the cursor's horizontal position as the firmware sees it to 0, so that the list command never winds up putting carriage returns in the middle of a token or string. On a real Apple screen, this would be indecipherable because it would keep overwriting the same character over and over for each line. But since Bobbin is just watching for characters to reach the monitor's output routine, then Bobbin produces program listings that can be faithfully fed back into AppleSoft later. When Bobbin is feeding input into the emulation for tokenization, and also for the -- run basic option we saw earlier, Bobbin adds extra listening hooks to watch and see if the program counter treads into routines for complaining about syntax errors and the like, or for code branches that deal with repeated or out-of-order line numbers in BASIC, so that it can gracefully terminate with an error, rather than let the emulator run amok when it's supposed to be tokenizing things or what have you. So anyway, Bobbin's highly hookable nature allows for very interesting features for the future. To start with, it means we could provide much friendlier and more robust interfaces targeted at manipulating DOS or ProDOS disk images than the awkward scripting we saw earlier. It also means we could potentially use Bobbin as a cross-assembler. We could port the SC macro assembler, or the original Merlin 8 assembler, for use in modern systems without having to actually rewrite those assemblers. Just write hooks to feed the assembly files into memory and jump the program counter to a suitable place to do the assembly, and catch the binary output to toss out into a file. Now, the obvious drawbacks here are that many things may get awkward if you're dealing with files that don't fit easily into an Apple II's available memory, though probably smarter hooks could work around this. And of course, compiling things in an emulator is liable to take significantly more time than it would in a native reimplementation. Bobbin won't be replacing Brutal Deluxe's excellent Merlin 32 cross-assembler anytime soon. The current plan is to support scripted hooks, possibly in Python or maybe Lua, so that users can write their own hooks and wrapper programs that can listen for bus events or program counter trips, and manipulate the CPU or memory in response, just as Bobbin's own built-in commands do internally. In fact, some of Bobbin's current command modes might be re-implemented in the future as separated scripts. It's also planned that, by the same mechanisms, users could write custom peripheral emulation scripts that can be plugged into Bobbin. Well, that's all we have time for in this brief mini-talk. Thanks for your time and interest, and let me know what you think. I plan to post future updates on this and other projects on my Mastodon account, shown here. Thanks very much.